Hello, I'd like to speak with you now about communicative repertoires. First, I'd like to remind you that our goal here is to understand speaking and writing as doing, being, valuing, believing combinations. This approach, which aligns with a post-structural approach to language, is called discourse. I want to briefly define discourse. G distinguishes this approach to discourse, calling it Big D discourse. Rhymes calls this communicative repertoires. Other post-structuralists will call it discourse with a lowercase d. Multiple names, but the idea around discourse is that discourses are ideological or connected to one's beliefs, systems of beliefs. That discourses resist internal criticisms, meaning that a particular discourse or discourse community is going to resist internal critique from the set of values that support that, a set of values and identity positions that support that particular discourse. Discourses are defined in relationship to other discourses. The boundaries around one discourse are often defined by saying we are not them. This particular discourse is a discourse connected, for example, to Republican politics. We are not the Democrats. Democrats have their own particular discourse. Now, this doesn't have to be in relation to large political parties or political affiliations. This can be as broad as the discourse practices or the language practices of a particular language variety in a particular location, or as narrow as a particular affinity group, religious group, or community of practice. Discourses promote specific concepts, viewpoints, and values. Betsy Rhymes reminds us that discourses, when she tries to answer this question, so what do discourses actually look like? Because it still seems like somewhat of a vague concept. She says that discourses are locally defined boundaries as discerned in classroom talk in relationship to English language education and language teaching. Furthermore, she says discourses can include and be identified by kinds of words used or lexical variety, names, the names of different individuals, or proper nouns, ways of speaking, that includes linguistic styling as well as language varieties, gestures, including extralinguistic signs and signals. It can also include turn-taking habits between different interlocutors, and sometimes even multiple languages in addition to language varieties. G argues that individuals occupy a primary discourse. This is the discourse that you are born into. He says that people are apprenticed early in life during their primary socialization as members of particular families within sociocultural settings. And by the time we are children, our primary discourse has transmuted into our life world discourse, or our culturally distinctive way of being an everyday person, not a specialist of some sort, but an everyday person in a particular context. Many people say that this discourse, they think of this as their authentic or true self. G argues that one's primary discourse is often connected to one's initial way of speaking and being in the world. G argues that secondary discourses are what people or individuals acquire and people are apprenticed as part of their socialization within various local, state, or national groups and institutions outside early home and peer group socialization. For example, secondary discourses might be socialized into a secondary discourse practice through churches or temples or mosques. One might be socialized into primary discourses because a social group, a gang, a club, schools, or even offices. G furthermore argues that some people are bidiscursal, meaning people who have or are mastering two contesting or conflicting discourses. Bidiscursal folks G argues, are the ultimate source for change because bidiscursal folks are socialized into two different discourses, which could mean they, from an early age, learn two different languages and sets of cultural and social practices. They learn to move between two different sets of language variety and the social and cultural practices aligned with those varieties. G argues that the history of discourse is a history of struggle, contestation, and change. And then we can see how by discursal people can create new discourses through code switching, through challenging by internally critiquing one discourse with the other, because they have a perfect mastery over multiple discourses. Now, Betsy Rhymes explains to us that there are different categories that you can use to explore your and your students' discourse in the classroom. I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier, which she says is a list of things you can look for to be able to identify the contours of a particular discourse. Now, I want to remind you first that your students will be able to occupy multiple discourses at any given time. So this is not a fixed thing, but if we use this as this list that Rhymes gives us as a map to point us towards both the primary discourse and multiple discourse communities of our students, it will be important to allow us to be able to facilitate students' language acquisition, particularly standard academic English language acquisition, and to better understand and value our students' linguistic practices outside of the classroom walls and incorporate their funds of knowledge and linguistic knowledge and experiences into the classroom. This is very important from a sociocultural perspective, where we see that it's incumbent upon the instructor not just to focus on presenting information, but to co-construct and connect new information to students' past knowledge and experiences. So in order to understand students' past knowledge and experiences with discourse, we can look to nicknames or names. So you might ask yourself, what different names do you and your peers use for students or teachers? You can also look for popular culture references. What pop cultural icons do students and teachers allude to? You may look towards gestures. What are some of the characteristic gestures students and teachers often use? You may also look towards turn-taking habits. Is highly overlapping speech common or expected? Are long pauses more often the norm? You could also look towards ways of telling stories. What characteristic ways of telling stories do you and your peers have? You could also look at the different languages and language varieties that are in play in any given interaction. What languages are in use? What language varieties are in use? By whom and with whom? And you also look at the pronunciation of certain words. Are different languages pronounced differently by different people? Which are used more often and which are not used?